Warm greetings. Whether you're winding down from a long day or just needing a little bit of peace and quiet, you've made it to the right place. Breathe slow and easy and get comfortable. This time is your time and yours alone. Let the soft noise of the world drift out of reach as you feel your body slowly sink into a deep drowsiness. This is your time to relax. Today, I will be rambling about one of California's most disturbing urban legends, the Dark Watchers of Big Sur. However, before we ramble our way to a deep sleep, I would love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always so interesting to see who's joining from all around the world. And now, dim the lights, take a nice sip of ice-cold water, and sink deeper and deeper into comfort. And join me as we ramble on about these terrifying, ghostly beings. Along a quiet stretch of California's central coast, there is a place where the mountains seem to lean forward, pressing against the Pacific with soft and stubborn silence. This is Big Sur, a region not known for cities or noise, but for the long hush of sea winds and the deep hush of old pines. Here, the cliffs rise in a slow ripple from the ocean's edge, and mists move like breath over the ridgelines. It is a place shaped more by time than by people. The roads here bend with the hills. The fog rolls in like a tide of memory, and high above the wandering trails and coastal brush, people have reported something strange, something that does not speak or move or even come close. They are known as the Dark Watchers. These figures, described as tall, silent, and cloaked in shadow, have become part of the folklore surrounding Big Sur. But unlike most ghost stories, which are tethered to a house, a tragedy, or a name, the Watchers belong to the land itself. They are seen on high ledges, against the last light of day, or in the low hush of dawn, always still, always distant. Long before the land was called California, and even before the trails had names, the Chumash people lived along these hills and coastlines. Though much of their oral tradition has faded with time, there are quiet records, passed through generations, that describe the presence of watchful spirits in the mountains. These were not gods and not quite ancestors, but something in between, beings that stood along the cliffs, silent and unmoving, appearing only at the edges of the day. The Chumash treated them with reverence and a careful distance. To approach was to disturb the balance. To acknowledge was enough. Later, in the 1700s, Spanish missionaries began moving up the coast, building missions and settlements as they went. Among their journals and observations, there were occasional references to strange figures seen watching from the hills. Some missionaries believed them to be signs, symbols of spiritual warfare or protection. Others noted them more casually, remarking on dark silhouettes that appeared on distant ridgelines at sunrise and dusk. They remained unexplained and soon faded into the folds of older, forgotten stories. By the 1800s, ranchers had begun settling into the Big Sur region. These were quiet, isolated lives. Long days spent riding across open land, with only the wind and wildlife for company. It was during this period that the Dark Watchers began to appear more regularly in personal accounts. One rancher, writing in the late 19th century, recalled pausing to rest his horse near a stream. As he looked toward the cliffs above, He noticed a tall figure standing perfectly still on the ridge. It appeared to wear a long cloak and some kind of wide-brimmed hat. No movement, no reaction, just stillness. When he blinked, the ridge was empty. He didn't speak of it for years, not until he heard another ranch hand describe something similar. A figure at dusk, always tall, always watching, always gone the moment you looked away. These early accounts were not dramatic. They were not told with fear or flair. In fact, what makes them so compelling is how plainly they were described. There was no aggression in the watchers, no contact, no voices, only presence. In the 1930s, a schoolteacher walking alone on a quiet trail near the cliffs reported seeing a figure standing high on a ridge. The sky was beginning to dim, the last of the sunlight catching on the rocks. She looked up and noticed what she first thought was a large tree or post, but it was shaped like a person, tall, narrow, and completely still. She raised her hand, as if to wave. The figure did not respond. She turned her head just for a moment, and when she looked again, the ridge was empty. Years later, she heard locals refer to similar sightings. That's when she realized she wasn't alone. Perhaps one of the most poetic connections to the Dark Watchers comes from Robinson Jeffers, a writer who lived near the Carmel coast in the early 20th century. His poems often spoke of the landscape, its solitude, its wildness, its watchfulness. Though he never directly named them, many believe his work was inspired by personal encounters with these figures. In his lines, the hills seem to have eyes, and the silence seems to carry meaning. Whether or not he saw them is uncertain, but the watchers are certainly felt in his words. Even John Steinbeck's family, particularly his son Thomas, would recall that the people of Big Sur spoke of the Dark Watchers as if they were simply a part of the place. Not legend, not fiction, just a reality that lived quietly in the background, the same way fog or wind does. They were rarely questioned, only acknowledged. In 1951, a hiker wandering the trails near Pfeiffer Big Sur spotted a figure standing alone on a narrow ridge. The sky was soft with evening color, and the air was still. The figure appeared as a dark outline, human in shape, but with no visible detail. No movement, no sound. The hiker watched for a full minute, then looked down to adjust his footing. When he looked back, the ridge was empty. Sightings like this are common across decades, always with similar details. Tall shapes, cloaked in shadow or mist, standing on ridges or cliffs, unmoving and distant. Some witnesses describe a wide-brimmed hat or long garment, though never in clear focus. There are no footsteps, no interactions, no explanations. The watchers seem content to remain still. They never chase, they never follow. They only appear and then vanish. This is not a haunting in the traditional sense. There are no flickering lights or sudden chills. But those who've seen the watchers often describe a peculiar feeling, a pause in the world, as if something just stepped beyond the veil of normal time. The wind quiets, the birds fall silent, and for a moment, everything feels gently suspended. The presence of the Dark Watchers does not seem tied to any specific event or era. They have been seen by indigenous people, by missionaries, by poets, and by backpackers. There is no single origin point, no tragic tale to explain their form. They simply are, As the 20th century moved forward, Big Sur remained largely untamed. Despite the slow crawl of development, despite roads being paved, cabins being built, and more people arriving to witness the coast's beauty, there were still long, unlit stretches where the forest kept its secrets. And in those places, the dark watchers continued to appear. These figures have never seemed interested in human lives, and yet they have always remained present within them. They arrive in quiet moments, often just before nightfall or during the first pale hour of morning. They are seen by people who do not go looking for them. They are never captured clearly, never approached, never truly explained. But they are seen again and again. In the 1960s, a handful of state park rangers working in Big Sur reported sightings of tall, dark shapes on the more remote ridgelines. These rangers, used to long days spent monitoring trails and tending to the forest, often worked alone. One ranger in particular described the sensation of being watched while hiking the steep trail near Ventana Wilderness. When he turned around, he saw what looked like a person, tall, slender, completely still, standing at the top of a far-off hill. No movement, no sound, just presence. He kept walking, never taking his eyes off it. But after a few steps and a brief glance at the trail ahead, the figure was gone. He told his supervisor, who simply nodded and said, "It happens more than you'd think." Years later, in the 1970s, a motorist pulled off the narrow highway, one to stretch his legs and admire the view. The ocean was calm. The hills were painted in pale gold. But as he looked up toward one of the steep rock faces, he noticed a shadow that seemed out of place. At first, he thought it was a tree stump or a weathered post, but then he realized it was perfectly upright, slightly broader at the top, and, most unsettling of all, it hadn't been there a moment before. He blinked, looked away, and when he looked back, nothing. In 1977, a local artist visiting the area for inspiration brought back more than sketches of the sea. He had been hiking near one of the trails just north of Julia Pfeiffer Burns State Park when he felt the distinct impression of being watched. Looking toward the ridge above, he spotted a figure in the distance, tall, dark, and unmoving, standing among the scattered boulders. He described it as having a long cloak and what looked like a wide-brimmed hat, though he could never make out its features. He later recreated the scene in a charcoal drawing, the watcher rendered without a face, its form blending into the rocks and trees around it. He wasn't frightened, only deeply unsettled, as if he'd witnessed something he wasn't meant to see. Into the 1980s, stories continued quietly. One camper near a forested inlet woke early one morning before dawn. The fire had gone out. The fog had rolled in low and thick. And there, just beyond the circle of trees, stood a figure, not approaching, not hiding, just watching. When the camper rose to wake their partner, the figure was no longer there. There were no footsteps, no branches disturbed. The morning unfolded as if nothing had happened, and yet the memory of that figure lingered. In the early 2000s, as technology became more accessible, hikers began bringing cameras, phones, and later drones to document their travels. Yet even with these tools, the dark watchers remained elusive. One backpacker in 2001 reported seeing 3 dark shapes on a ridge across the valley. They stood like statues, equal distance apart, perfectly upright. He snapped several photos, but none showed the figures he swore were there. Later, he described the sensation not just of being watched, but of being measured, as if the watchers weren't simply observing, but deciding whether to remain. In 2005, a nature photographer captured the golden hour along the cliffs. Through his viewfinder, he noticed a shape on the far ridge. It was clearly a figure, he said, tall and silent, like someone lost in thought. But when he zoomed in, the shape dissolved into the haze. No detail, no silhouette, only mist. He tried to take another photo, but the battery drained unexpectedly. When he checked the images later, the ones he'd taken near the figure were blank. Another account came from a fire watch volunteer in 2008. Posted in a lookout tower during a particularly dry summer, the man kept binoculars near at all times. One evening, while scanning the ridgelines for smoke, he noticed a figure standing far off. He watched it for nearly 10 minutes. It didn't move despite the high winds. It didn't shift or turn. Eventually, he looked away to call it in, thinking it might be a hiker. But when he returned to the binoculars, the ridge was empty once again. These stories are not isolated. They echo one another across time. In 2011, a solo backpacker on the Pine Ridge Trail described watching a dark shape move slowly across the ridge above him. It didn't walk exactly. It floated, but not in the way ghosts are said to. It was subtle, effortless, like a shadow following the edge of the wind. He tried to call out to it, but no sound left his mouth. Passed behind a boulder and did not return. In 2015, a small group of paranormal enthusiasts visited Big Sur with audio equipment and EMF sensors. They camped overnight near one of the lesser-used trailheads and reported a low humming that seemed to rise just before dawn. The air grew thick, and one of them noticed a faint shape standing on a nearby slope. They described it as narrow with no face or outline, but undeniably there. When they approached the spot later in daylight, there were no tracks, no disturbance of the soil, just pine needles and rock, quiet as ever. These encounters continue into the present. In 2019, a couple hiking the steep Pruitt Ridge Trail stopped to catch their breath. Looking up, they noticed a tall figure watching from the next rise. They stood and stared for nearly 10 minutes, unsure what to make of it. It never moved, never reacted. When they continued up the trail and reached the ridge themselves, it was empty. Nothing but wind, wildflowers, and the creak of old trees. Modern sightings are often accompanied by a familiar pattern. The wind dies down, the forest seems to pause, and the watcher appears. The feeling is not fear exactly. It's quiet unease, noticing that something is just slightly off, but not knowing what it is. By the time the 1990s arrived, Big Sur had begun to feel a little more traveled. The roads were better maintained, the trails more clearly marked. Campgrounds filled more quickly in the warmer months. Yet even with more visitors walking its paths, much of the land remained as it always had, tangled with wild growth, softened by fog, and steeped in the quiet weight of time. The dark watchers, though rarely spoken of in guidebooks or glossy brochures, had not left. Their sightings simply became more personal, more private. For some, they became a kind of local knowledge, something unspoken but understood. Those who lived nearest the hills didn't claim to see them often. They only said that some places felt watched, not in fear and not in warning, just noticed. In 1991, a part-time trail worker from Monterey County spent several weeks assisting with erosion repairs along a high-elevation path above the Big Creek area. One evening, while preparing his return down the slope, he paused to stretch and looked back toward the upper ridge. He saw what looked like a tall figure standing where the trail curved near a rock shelf. No movement, no wind, no sound. The worker stood there for several minutes, waiting for the figure to move or descend, and never did. Eventually, he descended alone and later returned with a co-worker. Nothing was there. Later that same year, in the quiet of early winter, a maintenance crew member working near a remote pullout described seeing what he believed was a man in a coat standing along the tree line. The sky was overcast, the air damp. As he approached to offer help, the figure appeared to lean slightly forward, but did not speak or walk. Then it seemed to fold back into the pines. He chalked it up to low visibility, though he noted that no footprints were left in the wet leaves. In 1993, a local woman living in a small cabin along a private stretch of road recalled hearing of the watchers from her grandfather, who had worked with livestock in the 1940s. She said he would always bring the sheep in before dusk, not because of predators, but because he believed it was better not to be out when the hills began to watch back. As a girl, she had never seen them, but in the early 90s, during an evening walk with her dog, she noticed a tall silhouette standing on a ridge behind her home. She did not approach. The dog did not bark. They stood quietly, then turned back toward home. She didn't speak of it to anyone until much later. Throughout the mid-90s, there were whispers in small communities that certain overlooks had a feeling to them, places where people would stop talking without knowing why, or where children would go quiet without prompting. A camp host stationed at a small state-managed site in 1995 said she would often see campers pause on the nearby trail, their eyes fixed on a high bend in the ridge. Some would squint, some would frown and then move along. No one ever spoke of what they saw. One report from 1996 involved a pair of amateur birdwatchers hiking along a lightly marked path near the Limekill area. They reached a clearing to watch the canopy when one of them noticed a slender vertical form on the slope above. It was described as being slightly too tall and too narrow to be a tree. They kept watching, expecting it to sway or shift with the wind, but it never did. When clouds rolled in, the figure slowly became harder to see and eventually disappeared into the mist. They didn't record it. They didn't speak of it again until years later. It's during this time, the late 1990s, that the watchers became more than isolated sightings. They became a kind of coastal folklore, passed between friends, family members, and longtime locals. The figure on the ridge, the motionless presence at dusk, the tall silhouette that seemed darker than it should have been. Not frightening, not violent, just there. In 1997, a man working part-time for a coastal weather station shared in a local community bulletin that he had glimpsed something familiar one morning while walking to a monitoring point. He never used the term dark watcher. He only described a shadowed figure at elevation, visible for about 20 seconds before it vanished into a fold in the hill. He described the experience as strange, but not supernatural, just quiet. And in 1999, during a reunion of retired state park workers, one former ranger shared his memory of spotting a watcher back in the 1970s. He asked if anyone else had seen them. Several nodded. No one elaborated. They simply returned to their coffee and the sound of birds moving in the brush behind them. It's during these final years before the millennium that the watchers seem to have passed into a kind of gentle legend. No longer just personal sightings, and not yet part of internet mythology. They existed in a quiet corner of memory. Those who had seen them rarely spoke of it unless they were with someone who had seen them too. It wasn't a secret exactly, just something that lived better in silence. There is no sharp ending to these reports, no moment where the watchers stopped appearing. If anything, it seems that their presence simply shifted, less seen perhaps, but still felt. Always distant, always still, always slightly beyond the line of understanding. As the years turned and the century changed, Big Sur remained, in many ways, untouched. Though more people visited its cliffs and trails, and though new names appeared on old maps, the land itself did not bend to time. The fog still moved across the ridges with no urgency. The wind still pressed gently through the trees. The quiet still held firm. And even in this new era, when most of the world became louder, faster, and brighter, there were still moments when something watched from the hills. Unlike the stories told in earlier decades, modern sightings of the Dark Watchers are not often written down in journals or whispered over fences. They tend to appear quietly, tucked into travel blogs, passed between hikers over late fires, or mentioned in passing to park staff who know when not to ask too many questions. The feeling, as always, has remained the same. Calm, still, and just a little too strange to ignore. In 2001, two backpackers hiking a narrow trail along a dry ridge near Pfeiffer Big Sur State Park reported seeing three tall, unmoving shapes standing across the valley. The figures were spaced apart, one on each rise. They did not sway with the wind. They did not respond to the movement of birds or branches. The hikers watched for nearly 10 minutes before turning a corner and losing sight of them. When they returned to that same spot the next day, nothing was there. No footprints, no fallen limbs, only silence. A few years later, in 2005, a photographer visiting from out of state had planned to capture the ocean fog rolling across the hilltops at sunset. As he set up his tripod along the viewpoint trail, he noticed a form, upright and still, standing far above the ridgeline. Through his lens, it looked like a person, tall and thin, perhaps in a coat. But when he adjusted the focus, the figure blurred unnaturally, as if the light around it refused to settle. He took several photos. In each one, the shape was either missing entirely or appeared as a distortion in the air. The figure had not moved, but the camera would not hold it. In 2011, a solo backpacker on the Pine Ridge Trail stopped to rest beneath a clearing just before dusk. As the sun lowered behind the ridge, he glanced up and saw a dark figure standing against the last line of light. It didn't startle him. It didn't seem close. He described it as something that had been there long before he noticed it, waiting. He looked away briefly to check his watch. When he looked back up, The ridge was empty. Later, in 2019, a couple camping along the coastal slopes near Pruitt Ridge shared a quiet experience that mirrored many of the stories that came before. At sunrise, as the light poured across the ridgelines, they noticed a figure standing alone on a high point just beyond their view. It wasn't moving, it wasn't facing them, but it was there. It stood in perfect stillness for nearly 20 minutes. When clouds began to gather and shift across the slope, the figure disappeared. There was no trace in the earth, no footprints in the dewy ground, only a lingering feeling that something had been present. More recently, in 2022, a drone video posted by a traveler briefly showed what appeared to be a tall shadowed form on a narrow ridge. It was visible for just one frame, flickering slightly, and then gone. Most dismissed it as a camera error, a glitch in the recording. But a few who watched closely noted that the figure's shape, its height, its posture, the suggestion of a cloak or wide hat, matched what had been described by people long before drones had ever existed. These modern accounts are fewer, perhaps, but no less precise. The details still echo through the years. The watchers remain tall, still, distant, always on high ground, always silent. They appear at dawn or just before dusk, in the half-light where the world holds its breath. Despite the rise of smartphones, digital lenses, and instant connection, there are still no clear photographs, no recordings that capture them for more than a second, no definitive evidence. But maybe that is part of what keeps the mystery alive. The watchers have never asked to be documented. They have only ever asked to be left alone. Today, many locals speak of them the same way their grandparents did, not as folklore, not as threats, but as part of the place. They are not feared, and they are not chased. Some trails are simply walked with quieter footsteps. Some ridges are approached with a little more stillness. And sometimes, when the fog moves softly and the wind goes still, people pause and look up. The world may have changed, but the watchers have not. They do not follow progress. They do not step forward when called. They remain where they have always been, at the edge of the sky, framed in light and silence. Some stories linger not because they ask for attention, but because they never try to explain themselves. For over 100 years, and likely far longer, the Dark Watchers have stood on the ridges of Big Sur, quiet, still, and unnoticed by most. They do not demand belief. They do not perform. But for those who have seen them, their presence is hard to forget. Figure too tall, a shadow too still, a moment too quiet, and so people have wondered. They wonder what the Watchers are and why they appear. Some begin with the familiar. They point to natural explanations, to mirages, tricks of light, long shadows cast by uneven hills. One common theory is the Brocken Spectre, where sunlight hits fog in such a way that a hiker's own shadow appears larger than life, standing tall in the mist. It can look like a figure, even a cloaked one, surrounded by a halo of light. But in most Watcher sightings, there is no ridge behind the observer. The shadow is never projected. The figure is above them, far off, standing in a place they cannot reach. Others speak of psychological projection, that after hours of hiking alone, after hunger and fatigue take hold, the mind fills in the blanks, places a shape where the trees shift, It makes a figure from the mist. The brain searches for something familiar in the distance and settles on a person. But these explanations don't always sit well with those who've witnessed it. Their memories are often clear, precise. They remember not panic, but stillness, not confusion, but certainty that something was there, watching, quietly. So then the thoughts drift outward into the places science does not always go. Some say the watchers are spirits tied to the land, not lost souls, but entities older than memory, not malevolent, not kind, just present. They don't belong to people. They belong to the earth itself, the ridges, the sky, the long shadows that stretch across stone at sunset. They are part of the balance, like tide or fog or time. The Chumash, who lived in the region long before highways reached the cliffs, told of silent beings who stood on mountaintops. They didn't name them. They didn't approach them. They simply knew they were there and left them in peace. Maybe that was always the right way to respond. Others say the watchers are sentinels, guardians of some thin place between worlds. That Big Sur's cliffs, with their quiet and their height and their haze, open into something deeper. That at certain times of day, in certain states of stillness, the line between what is and what might be becomes very soft. And through it the watchers come. A few go further. They speak of dimensional boundaries, of beings who slip into view only when the air is just right, and leave no trace because they were never fully here to begin with. Not ghosts, not aliens, something else entirely. Perhaps they live in a version of the world just slightly out of reach, one we almost see but never fully catch. There are also gentler ideas. Some believe the watchers are not beings at all but echoes, faint impressions of something ancient, not alive but repeating, like a bell that was rung long ago, still carrying its sound through time. They appear not because they choose to, but because something left its mark there long ago. And now, when the light bends just so, we see the outline again. And some think they are not meant to be seen at all, that we only catch them when we are still enough, when the noise has faded, when we've walked far enough from the road, from the phones, from the day, that the watchers are always there. But most of the time we move too fast to notice. Perhaps that's the only explanation that matters. They're not asking to be found. They've never once moved toward those who see them. They make no sound. They leave no mark. They don't try to be remembered. And yet, they are. They've been seen by ranchers and artists, travelers and locals, children and elders. They've appeared in the early morning and just before dark. Always above, always still. It's tempting to look for answers, to pin down the unknown. But some things stay with us because they are never solved, because they are not questions at all but places, feelings, moments. The watchers have never changed, and maybe that's why they remain, rooted in the silence of the cliffs, where the wind speaks low and the trees lean toward the sea. Their mystery is not something to unravel. It is something to walk beside. So if one day you find yourself alone on a trail in Big Sur, and the air turns quiet, and the light grows long, and the ridge above holds a shape that does not move, you may not need to speak. You may not need to stare. Just walk a little slower, breathe a little deeper, and carry the stillness with you. The watchers were never looking for us, But sometimes we look back, and that is enough.